Picture this. It's the summer of 1985. You're standing in an American car dealership, and a salesman points to a little box on wheels and says the price out loud. $3,990. Brand new. Not used, not a demo. Brand new, off the boat, with a warranty. Your jaw hits the floor. Because up to that point, the cheapest new car in America, the Chevy Chevette, stickered around $5,500. This thing undercut it by $1,500. It sounded like the deal of the century. Like America had finally cracked the code on cheap, honest transportation. Except it wasn't a deal at all. It was one of the most spectacular automotive belly flops this country has ever seen. And today I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened. Stick around because this story has everything. A wild entrepreneur who met Henry Kissinger in an airport bathroom, a factory in a communist country that reportedly used wooden mallets for quality control, a car so slow you could time its 0 to 60 run with a calendar, and a resale value that one longtime auto writer described as having the trade-in value of a dying cocker. That's not me being cruel. That's how the industry itself remembers. By the end of this, you'll understand why the Yugo didn't just fail. It became the yardstick. To this day, when something is cheap and terrible, people still call it a Yugo. That's a legacy money can't. So let's rewind the tape and start where every great disaster starts, with a promise that sounded too good to be true. The man at the center of all this was Malcolm Bricklin. If you don't know that name, buckle up, because this guy was a legend in the American car business, and not always for the right reason. In the late 1960s, Bricklin brought Subaru to the United States. His first car was a tiny thing called the 360. It weighed under 1,000 pounds and took over 30 seconds to reach 50 miles an hour. His slogan was literally, "Cheap and ugly does it." Consumer Reports rated it not acceptable. But Bricklin never cared. He always bounced back. One industry publisher compared him to those inflatable toy clowns. You punch it, it falls over, and it pops right back up smiling. That relentless optimism is the engine that drives this entire story. After Subaru, Bricklin tried building his own sports car, the Bricklin SV1, with gull-wing doors and a safety-first philosophy. That burned through millions and even cost a Canadian politician his job. Then he imported some rebadged Fiats. That fell apart too. So by the early 1980s, Bricklin was hunting for his next big score. His orders to his team were blunt. Go find me the cheapest car in the world. And one of his men, a sharp operator named Tony Simonera, found it in the last place anyone would look, a country called Yugoslavia, a communist nation cobbled together after the First World War, sitting behind what people once called the Iron Curtain. And there, in a dusty factory, sat the answer to Bricklin's prayers. Here's my favorite part of the legend. And this one's actually true. Bricklin didn't even know where Yugoslavia was. He admitted it himself. As he waited for his first flight to Belgrade, he found himself at a urinal in the VIP lounge of the Zurich airport. And who's standing right next to him? Henry Kissinger, the former United States Secretary of State. Bricklin, being Bricklin, introduces himself right there and says he's trying to import cars from Yugoslavia. Kissinger, without missing a beat, hands him a business card. Turns out Kissinger ran a high-powered geopolitical consulting. Bricklin became a client, and just like that, a lot of the red tape that should have slowed him down simply melted away. You cannot make this stuff up. So what was the car? It was built by a company called Zastava in Kragujevac, south of Belgrade. And here's a detail most people miss. Zastava wasn't even mainly a car company. They'd been making weapons and firearms since the 1850s. Cars were a side business they picked up after World War II, building vehicles under license from the Italian company Fiat. The Yugo itself was based on the Fiat 128, a design dating back to the late 1960s. So the brand new car Americans were about to fall for was, under the skin, technology already old enough to buy itself a beer. And honestly, that's not a knock on the Yugoslavs. By communist standards, this little car was a genuine achievement. Let me put that in perspective. Over in East Germany, people drove the Trabant, a car with a body made partly of compressed cotton waste and a smoky two-stroke engine with a waiting list that could stretch past 10 years. Next to that, the Yugo was a rocket ship. It had a real four-cylinder engine, a real steel body, and you could actually drive one home the same day. In its home country and parts of Europe, the Yugo was no joke. It sold nearly 800,000 units worldwide over its lifetime. It was decent transportation for people who had very little. The problem, and this is the whole problem, is that the standards of 1980s America were nothing like the standards of the Eastern Bloc. Bricklin knew he couldn't ship the car over as is. His product man, Tony Simonera, did a bumper-to-bumper audit and identified over 500 changes needed just to make it street legal and acceptable. 500 changes. Think about that. When you have to fix 500 things before customers will accept your product, that should be a flashing red warning light. But the work got done. Zastava built a separate assembly line staffed with hand-picked workers who earned extra pay, about $1.23 an hour more, to build the American cars. The model they landed on for the U.S. was the Yugo GV. Officially, those letters stood for good value, or great value, depending on who you asked. Both would age like milk. On the 25th of August, 1985, the Yugo went on sale in America, and Bricklin threw a launch party fit for a king at the famous Tavern on the Green in New York City's Central Park. Balloons, cowboy hats, models, the whole circus. And he made jaw-dropping claims. He said he had 400 dealers ready to go. He said he had 100,000 cars already pre-ordered. And most of all, he hammered on that magic number, $3,990. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $11,000 to $12,000 today. Still absurdly cheap for a brand new car. The press ate it up. Front page stories ran in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, even the National Enquirer. The marketing was genuinely clever. The whole campaign was built around that price, $39.90. The slogan was, "Everybody needs a Yugo sometime." The pitch was brilliant on paper. If you're a young person who can only afford a beat-up used car, why not buy a brand new Yugo for the same money? And if you're wealthy, buy one as a cheap little runabout, a third car to knock around town. It was aimed at everyone, and for a moment, it worked. The demand was there. The buzz was deafening. One writer said the low price guaranteed more noise than a bobcat in heat. America was curious. America was excited, and America was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between cheap and good. Here's the first real turn. In that first partial year, from August to the end of December 1985, they sold only about 3,895 cars, way below the hype. And the reason wasn't a lack of interest, it was a lack of cars. Yugoslavia simply couldn't build or ship them fast enough. In 1986, they sold nearly 36,000, but could only pry about 40,000 out of the factory all year. So Bricklin's supposed 100,000 pre-orders sat unfilled while impatient customers tapped their feet. But 1987 was the peak, the top of the mountain. Americans bought 48,812 Yugo. For one brief shining moment, it looked like the gamble had paid off. And then the cars actually got used. That's when the wheels came off. Sometimes literally, if you believe the legends. Let me walk you through what really went wrong because I want to be straight with you. A lot of the Yugo horror stories have grown taller but even the verified problems were bad enough to sink the ship. So let's separate fact from folklore. Because the truth is the Yugo didn't need much exaggeration to look terrible. It managed that on its own. And the biggest single mechanical villain in this whole story is a humble little part most drivers never think about. A rubber timing belt. That belt is where the tragedy really begins. Here's the deal. The Yugo's little engine was what's called an interference engine. In plain English, the pistons and valves share the same space at different moments, and a rubber belt keeps them perfectly synchronized so they never collide. If that belt breaks, the pistons and valves slam into each other, and you've got a wrecked engine. On the Yugo, that belt needed replacing around every 40,000 miles, a much shorter interval than many cars of the era. And here's the killer. A huge number of owners had no idea. This was a super cheap car, often bought by first-timers or people on tight budgets, folks who weren't dropping it off for scheduled service. So the belt would snap and the engine would grenade itself. Now, did engines blow up at 30,000 miles as a rule? Honestly, that specific claim is more legend than documented fact, and that's my read as someone who's dug into this. The real verifiable issue was the neglected timing belt taking out the engine, and it happening to enough people that word spread like wildfire, and word of mouth is exactly what killed this car. When your buddy's Yugo eats itself in the driveway, you tell 10 people. Those 10 tell 10 more. Pretty soon, the whole neighborhood knows Yugos are disposable garbage. At that point, the truth almost doesn't matter. The reputation takes on a life of its own, and it's absolutely brutal. Then there was the engine itself, which was, to put it kindly, weak. The US Yugo made about 55 horsepower from a 1.1-liter engine. To meet American emissions rules, they strangled it with an outdated carburetor, an old-school catalytic converter, and an air pump, choking the already feeble engine further. The result? Over 14 seconds to reach 60 miles an hour. 14 seconds. There were cars in 1985 that did it in half that. Top speed was about 86 miles per hour, making it, by many accounts, the slowest car you could buy in America. Merging onto a busy freeway wasn't a maneuver. It was an act of faith, a quick prayer, and a hard push on a pedal that had nothing left to give. Then we get to the build quality. This is where the Yugo earned its punchline status. One auto writer who actually toured the Zastava factory in 1986 described the quality control tools as big wooden mallets. Big enough, he joked, to straighten the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He described workers reportedly drinking plum brandy on the job, which supposedly explained the long lines at the factory restrooms. Is every detail literally true? Or is some of it a colorful reporter having fun? Probably a bit of both, and I'll flag that as opinion. But the underlying point stands. This was a communist-era factory in 1986, and the consistency and precision American buyers expected simply were not there. So what did that mean for owners? Rattles. Panels that didn't line up. Switches and trim that felt like they'd fall off if you looked at them wrong. Did parts literally fly off on the highway? That's the kind of story told at every backyard barbecue, and I have to be honest as the guy telling it. The dramatic, the door fell off at 70 tales are mostly folklore, exaggerated over decades for a laugh. What's real is that assembly quality was inconsistent. Things worked loose, and the car felt flimsy and cheap in a way that constantly reminded you it was flimsy and cheap. And when you're already nervous about your bargain purchase, every little rattle feels like doom creeping up on you. Here's what people forget. The Yugo actually came with a pretty generous warranty for the time. On paper, you were protected. But here's the catch. No warranty can fix. Dealer support and parts availability were a nightmare. This was an obscure car from an obscure country with a fragile supply chain. So when your Yugo broke, and it would break, getting it fixed could mean waiting weeks for a part to arrive from halfway across the world. A warranty means very little when your car sits dead in a service bay for a month over a $15 component. That's the kind of frustration that turns a customer into an enemy for life. And enemies talk loudly. Now we arrive at the nail in the coffin, the resale value, or rather, the total collapse of it. Most cars lose value over time. That's normal depreciation. But the Yugo didn't depreciate. It evaporated. Once the reputation took hold, once everybody knew the Yugo was junk, nobody wanted a used one. And I mean nobody. Trade-in values cratered toward pocket change. That auto writer put it perfectly, saying a used Yugo had the trade-in value of a dying Cocker Spaniel. Imagine buying a brand new car and watching it become nearly worthless in a matter of months. Not years. Months. For the families who scraped together that $39.90, that was a devastating gut punch. Think about who bought these cars. Many were people who didn't have much money to begin with. That was the entire pitch. An affordable brand new car for the everyday person. So these were folks who could least afford a financial beating, and they took the worst one in the business. They bought cheap to save money, and instead they lost their shirts. When the Yugo story gets told as comedy, and it usually does, we forget there were real people on the other end, real families who felt burned and betrayed. And that resentment is a huge part of why America turned on this car so hard, so fast, and so permanently. Betrayal has a long memory. Here's where I want to challenge the popular narrative, because it matters. The common story is that the Yugo proved Americans were done buying unreliable junk no matter how cheap. There's truth to that. But here's my honest take as someone who studies this market. Americans have always bought cheap, imperfect cars when the value made sense. The original Volkswagen Beetle was crude. Early Japanese cars were mocked before they conquered the world. So it wasn't just that the Yugo was cheap, it's that it broke the fundamental promise of a cheap car, which is simple, boring reliability. A cheap car gets forgiven a lot as long as it keeps running. The Yugo couldn't even do that, and that's the sin America wouldn't forgive. Think about it. If the Yugo had just been slow, ugly, and basic but bulletproof reliable, it might have carved out a real niche. Cheap and dependable is a winning formula. Just ask Toyota. But cheap and unreliable is the worst of both worlds. You saved on the sticker, then paid it all back and more in tow trucks, repair bills, and a resale value of essentially zero. That's why the timing belt failures and parts shortages mattered far more than the slow acceleration or cheap interior. People tolerate slow. People tolerate ugly. What they will not tolerate is being stranded on the roadside wondering if their brand new car is already dead. That, right there, is the real Yugo story. The sales numbers tell the whole tragic arc. Watch this collapse. 1987, the peak, nearly 49,000 cars. Then 1988 down to about 31,000. 1989 cratering to around 10,000. 1990 6,000. 1991 3,000. And in 1992, the final year, just 1,412 from nearly 50,000 to under 1,500 in 5 years. That's not a decline, that's a free fall. That's a car dying in public, in slow motion, for everyone to see. The reputation had done its work, word of mouth had done its work, and the American consumer, that ruthless, unforgiving judge, had delivered its final verdict. Then the outside world delivered the final blows. Back home, Yugoslavia was falling apart politically. In 1990, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency flagged over 126,000 Yugos for violating emissions rules. That recall effectively broke the company's back in America, and Yugo America folded in April of 1992. Then it got genuinely tragic. International sanctions shut down exports entirely. And in 1999, during the conflict in the region, NATO bombing destroyed the Zastava car factory itself. The very place these little cars were born was reduced to rubble. A grim ending for what started as a hopeful little bargain car full of promise. But here's the twist I love. The Yugo refused to die as a joke. Over time, something strange happened. It became a cult classic. That same auto writer compared it to the Tucker, the Corvair, and the Edsel, commercial disasters that became beloved collector oddities. And get this, well-preserved Yugos have sold at auction for real money. There are documented sales on Bring a Trailer of Yugos fetching around $9,500, more than twice the original price. Let that sink in. The worst car in America now commands a premium from collectors who adore its underdog story. There's a dedicated website, a registry, people digitizing the original factory parts catalog. The zealots, as one writer called them, are absolutely real. So what's the final lesson of the Yugo? To me, it's this. The Yugo wasn't killed by its price. $39.90 was a genuinely great price. It was killed by the gap between what it promised and what it delivered. It promised honest, reliable, brand new transportation for the common man and delivered a fragile, temperamental machine that too often left owners stranded and broke. It's a masterclass in how reputation is everything in the car business. You can survive being cheap. You can survive slow. You can even survive ugly. But you cannot survive breaking your promise to the customer. Once that trust is gone, no price on earth buys it back. The Yugo learned that the hard way, and it took the whole company down with it. And maybe that's why we still remember it. Not because it was the worst car ever built. It probably wasn't. Plenty of cars were mechanically worse. We remember it because it's the perfect story. The impossible price, the wild salesman, the communist factory, the spectacular collapse, and then, against all odds, the cult resurrection. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button because it genuinely helps more people find these stories. Subscribe for more automotive disasters and legends because I've got a garage full of them. And drop a comment below. Did you or anyone you know ever actually own a Yugo? I want the real story. The good, the bad, and the stranded on the highway. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.